February 1950. A wrecking ball swings through stained glass that once refracted light for presidents. The sound, they say you could hear it for blocks, wasn't just stone crumbling. It was something else. A kind of civic amnesia taking physical form. Each impact erased another room where Bertha Palmer had rewritten the rules of American society, where Impressionist paintings first touched American walls, where a self-made millionaire had dared to build a feudal fantasy on the shores of Lake Michigan and, for one golden moment, made the impossible real. The Potter Palmer Castle stood for 68 years. Its destruction took 6 weeks. What dies faster, a building, or the memory of what happened inside it? This is the story of Chicago's greatest architectural crime. But it's also something darker, something the city spent decades trying to forget. Because the Palmer Castle wasn't demolished by accident or natural decay. It was murdered deliberately, methodically, by a city that had decided its past was inconvenient. And in that murder, we can read the blueprint for how America has treated its own history ever since, as something disposable, something to be cleared away the moment it stops making money. The question isn't why the castle fell. The question is why we let it. Potter Palmer didn't start with castles. He started with dry goods, which is perhaps the least romantic origin story in American capitalism. Born in 1826 to Quaker parents in upstate New York, he arrived in Chicago in 1852 with modest capital and immodest ambition. The city then was barely a city, a swampy trading post where wooden buildings bred like bacteria and fire was not a disaster but a recurring seasonal event, like winter or cholera. Palmer opened a store. Not just any store, he revolutionized retail itself, introducing fixed prices, no more haggling, money-back guarantees, unheard of in an era when buyer beware was gospel, and the radical notion that shopping could be pleasant rather than adversarial. He displayed goods openly rather than keeping them behind counters. He advertised aggressively. He understood, decades before anyone else, that retail was theater and the customer was the audience. His store on Lake Street became Palmer & Company, then Potter Palmer & Company, then simply Palmer's, the kind of commercial establishment that defines a city. By the 1860s, he was selling more merchandise than any retailer between the coasts. He diversified into real estate, buying up State Street when it was still considered a bad investment, then single-handedly transforming it into Chicago's premier commercial corridor by relocating his own store there and convincing Marshall Field and Levi Leiter to follow. By 1865, his Palmer House was the grandest hotel between New York and San Francisco, a 6-story marvel of marble and walnut that announced to the world, Chicago was no longer a frontier outpost. When the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 incinerated it 13 days after it opened, along with most of the city, Palmer did something that defined his character completely. He borrowed heavily, some accounts say $1.7 million, an astronomical sum, and rebuilt bigger, grander, fireproof. The second Palmer House, which opened in 1873, became a legend. Its barbershop invented the brownie, reportedly at Bertha's request for a dessert that could be packed in box lunches for ladies attending the 1893 World's Fair. Its lobby glittered with silver dollars embedded in the floor. Its amenities included elevators, electric lights, and telephones before most Americans had seen any of these technologies. Palmer became Chicago personified, ruthless, inventive, absurdly confident, rising from ashes again and again. He accumulated wealth at a velocity that made even Gilded Age contemporaries nervous. But wealth hollows you out if you don't fill it with meaning. Palmer, by the 1870s, had money beyond measure and no one to share it with. He was 43, never married, consumed by business. He needed something more. Enter Bertha Matilda Honoré, 23 years his junior, the daughter of Henry Hamilton Honoré, a real estate developer who'd arrived in Chicago in 1855 and made his fortune in the same fire and rebuilding cycle that enriched Palmer. Bertha had been educated in convents and Parisian finishing schools. She was fluent in French, trained in art history, accomplished on the piano, possessed of the kind of beauty that made men stupid and the kind of intelligence that made them nervous. When she walked into a room, conversation stopped mid-sentence. They married in 1870. She was 21. He was 44. On paper, it looked like a conventional Gilded Age transaction, beauty for wealth, youth for security. In practice, it became something stranger and more potent, a partnership that would reshape not just Chicago society but American culture itself. Bertha refused to be decorative. She collected Impressionist paintings when American taste still considered them unfinished garbage. One critic called Monet's work colored fog. She championed women's rights when suffrage was a fringe cause associated with cranks and radicals. She turned social events into political theater, using guest lists like weapons and menus like manifestos. Potter gave her the resources. She gave him purpose. Together, they decided to build something that would announce to New York, to Europe, to history itself, Chicago had arrived, and it would not apologize for its swamp-born origins. They would build a castle. An actual, honest-to-God, European-style castle, planted audaciously on the shore of Lake Michigan like a gauntlet thrown at the feet of old money everywhere. The site Potter chose in 1882 was absurd, a narrow lot at 1350, North Lake Shore Drive, where the street met Bank Street, facing the cold indifference of Lake Michigan. The neighborhood was barely developed, modest homes, empty lots, the occasional storefront. The wind came off the water like a constant assault. Lake Shore Drive itself was still unpaved in places, more parkway than thoroughfare, designed for leisurely carriage rides rather than commercial traffic. It was the architectural equivalent of planting a flag on the moon. Potter hired Henry Ives Cobb, just 23 years old, fresh from studying architecture in his father's firm, and Charles Sumner Frost, equally young and hungry. They were the perfect choice, ambitious enough to attempt the impossible, talented enough to pull it off, and unknown enough to accept direction from a client who knew exactly what he wanted, a building that would make New York's Knickerbocker elite choke on their inherited silverware. The style they chose, Richardsonian Romanesque, was perfect for a man who'd built his fortune through brute determination. Named for Henry Hobson Richardson, whose Trinity Church in Boston and other landmark buildings had proven that American architecture didn't need to be a timid echo of European refinement, the style was heavy, muscular, unapologetic. Richardson had died in 1886, but his influence was spreading like wildfire through American architecture in the 1880s. The Palmer Castle would be an homage and a challenge, bigger than Trinity Church, bolder, more defiant. Construction began in 1882 and immediately became Chicago's favorite spectator sport. The foundation alone required innovative engineering, anchoring a 3-story stone fortress on lakefront soil prone to shifting and subsidence. They drove pilings deep, used massive granite blocks as a base, some weighing several tons, hauled by rail from quarries in Massachusetts and Minnesota. The newspapers reported on each shipment like it was international news. The walls rose in rusticated brownstone and granite, deliberately rough-hewn to emphasize weight and permanence. This was not a building trying to look delicate or refined. This was a building announcing it could withstand anything: fire, wind, social snobbery, Lake Michigan storms, time itself. The stones were laid with such precision that the joints were nearly invisible, creating an impression of monolithic strength. The scale was staggering. The main structure comprised 42 rooms across 3 floors, but that number barely captures the reality. There was a tower that rose over 100 feet, some accounts say 120 feet, offering views across Lake Michigan that must have felt like surveying your kingdom. The footprint covered roughly 100 feet by 100 feet, though the irregular shape and projecting elements made it feel even larger. The main entrance, a massive Romanesque arch that became the building's signature element, could have swallowed a railway car whole. It was deeply recessed, creating dramatic shadow even on bright days, and flanked by smaller arched openings that emphasized the central arch's dominance. The porte-cochere, an architectural feature Potter insisted on, allowed carriages to pull directly inside, depositing guests in a vestibule that felt more like a cathedral than a home. This was practical. Chicago winters are brutal, but also theatrical. You didn't merely arrive at the Palmer Castle. You entered it, were enveloped by it, were forced to acknowledge its weight and presence before you'd even met your hosts. The exterior details were relentless. Turrets at the corners. A crenellated roofline that referenced medieval fortifications. Paired and triple-arched windows on the upper floors. A rough-hewn stone water table at the base that made the building seem to grow organically from the earth. The masonry work alone employed dozens of stonemasons for 3 years, Irish immigrants mostly, men who'd learned their trade on European churches and brought those skills to Chicago's muddy lakefront. Stained glass windows, custom designed, depicted not religious scenes but secular beauty, florals, geometric patterns, jewel-toned abstractions that transformed sunlight into liquid color. These weren't purchased from catalogs, each was commissioned specifically for its location in the building, designed to work with the room's proportions and purpose. The glass came from Europe, from studios that had been making ecclesiastical windows for centuries. Now they were making windows for a merchant's castle. The symbolism wasn't subtle. Inside, the grandeur intensified. The Great Hall, what other homes would call a foyer, soared 3 stories, its open staircase ascending theatrically beneath a skylight that flooded the space with natural light. The stairs were stone at the base, transitioning to carved oak as they rose, each newel post a sculpture in itself. The effect was simultaneously inviting and intimidating. You could see where you were going, but you were forced to acknowledge the vertical scale of what Potter and Bertha had built. Oak paneling, imported from Europe, lined the walls of the principal rooms. Not merely decorative wainscoting but floor-to-ceiling wood architecture, carved panels, coffered ceilings, built-in cabinetry integrated seamlessly into the walls. The wood was dark, heavy, chosen to emphasize permanence and substance. In an age when most American homes were built of balloon-frame lumber covered in plaster and wallpaper, the Palmer Castle's oak paneling was a statement: this building will outlast your grandchildren. Fireplaces, over a dozen throughout the house, featured carved mantels, each a unique sculpture. Some were simple and geometric, emphasizing the stone's natural weight. Others were elaborately carved with foliage, grotesques, heraldic elements borrowed from European castles. The fireplaces weren't merely functional, though with Chicago winters, functionality mattered. They were territorial markers, each one announcing, "This room belongs to me." The ballroom occupied most of the second floor's north wing, its dimensions allowing for 300 guests comfortably, or 400 uncomfortably, which happened frequently. The ceiling was coffered oak, the walls covered in silk damask that could be changed seasonally. French doors opened onto a balcony overlooking the lake, allowing guests to step outside on warm evenings and feel the breeze while the orchestra played inside. But the art gallery was Bertha's particular obsession. Located on the 3rd floor with northern exposure, ideal for viewing paintings, its walls were covered in crimson silk damask, the better to showcase the paintings she was quietly acquiring from Europe, Monets, Renoirs, Pissarros, works that New York collectors still mocked as unfinished sketches. The room wasn't merely storage for art. It was a statement about what art could be, about Chicago's cultural sophistication, about Bertha's vision of American taste. She was building the finest collection of French Impressionist paintings in America, casually displayed in a private home as if Renoir and Degas were simply interior decoration. The cost? Contemporary accounts varied wildly, suggesting somewhere between $90,000 and $150,000, though the higher figure may have included furnishings and initial art purchases. One Chicago newspaper claimed the final cost exceeded $1 million, though this seems inflated. Adjusting for inflation barely captures the reality. This wasn't just money. This was imported European craftsmanship, custom everything, materials hauled halfway across a continent, labor costs that included housing and feeding dozens of workers for 3 years. The building process itself required a small village, stonemasons, carpenters, glaziers, plasterers, metal workers, painters, landscapers. Who built it? Ah, there's the invisible part of the story. The architects got their names carved in history. Cobb would go on to design the Newberry Library, the Chicago Athletic Association building, and much of the University of Chicago campus. Frost would design the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad Station and numerous commercial buildings. Potter and Bertha got the glory, their names in every newspaper, their parties chronicled in society columns. But the hands that actually raised those walls, carved that oak, fitted those windows, those belonged to immigrant laborers whose names no newspaper recorded. Irish stonemasons who'd learned their trade building churches in Cork and Dublin. German carpenters trained in joinery techniques centuries old. Italian plasterers who could make ceiling ornamentation look like frozen lace. Glaziers from England installing those massive stained glass windows in Chicago winters that could freeze fingers to metal tools. Men who lived in boarding houses on the west side, worked 12-hour days in all weather, and returned to tenements that Palmer's real estate investments often owned. They built beauty they would never inhabit, crafted spaces they would only enter through service entrances. The castle rose on backs that history forgot to count, built by hands that left no signature except in the stones themselves. The Palmer Castle opened in 1885, and Chicago society collectively lost its mind. The first grand reception, a ball for 800 guests, required a temporary tent structure in the gardens because even 42 rooms couldn't contain Bertha's ambition. The Chicago Tribune deployed adjectives like artillery, magnificent, stupendous, unparalleled, without rival in the West. But underneath the breathless coverage, you could detect something else, a kind of anxious question. Was this taste, or was it excess? Was Potter Palmer a visionary, or a parvenu trying too hard? Was the castle Chicago's crown jewel or its embarrassment? Bertha answered that question by doing something radical. She made the castle work. She turned it into Chicago's unofficial cultural embassy, hosting not just society balls but intellectual salons, art exhibitions, political fundraisers, literary readings. The castle became permeable in ways that old money mansions in New York never were. If you were interesting, artist, writer, activist, foreign dignitary, you might receive an invitation regardless of your bank account or family tree. This was revolutionary. Gilded Age society was supposed to be about exclusion, about bloodlines and breeding. Bertha made it about ideas and accomplishment. The castle's drawing rooms saw suffragists debating voting rights with society matrons who'd never considered the question. The dining room hosted dinners where businessmen sat beside poets, where German-born brewers conversed with Boston Brahmins. Bertha spoke French fluently and used it to put European visitors at ease, making them understand that Chicago, muddy, smoky, slaughterhouse Chicago, was not the cultural wasteland they'd assumed. When the World's Columbian Exposition came to Chicago in 1893, the event that would transform the city from regional upstart to global player, Bertha was appointed the only female member of the National Commission and chair of the Board of Lady Managers. It was a position of genuine power, overseeing the Women's Building, coordinating international women's participation, managing a budget of over $200,000. She used the castle as unofficial headquarters, hosting international delegates for breakfast meetings, entertaining suffragists and reformers, leveraging her social position to advance women's causes. The exposition itself was Chicago's great coming-out party, a declaration that the city that had burned to ash 22 years earlier now rivaled New York and Boston in culture, commerce, and confidence. Over 27 million visitors came to see the White City rise beside Lake Michigan. Many of those visitors ended up at the Palmer Castle, where Bertha held court like the unofficial queen of the fair. The castle's art gallery became particularly significant during this period. Bertha had been collecting Impressionist paintings since the early 1880s, advised by art dealer Sarah Tyson Hollowell and her own educated eye. She bought Monets for a few hundred francs when European dealers couldn't give them away. She acquired Renoirs that Parisian critics dismissed as incompetent. She purchased Pissarros, Sisley's, a Degas, multiple works by Mary Cassatt, supporting a female artist when such support was radical. By the 1890s, the Palmer collection was the finest assembly of French Impressionism in America, displayed in a private home as if these revolutionary paintings were simply part of civilized domestic life. New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art wouldn't acquire its first Impressionist painting until 1889, Manet, and even that was controversial. The Art Institute of Chicago, founded in 1879, was still building its collection. Bertha Palmer, in her third-floor gallery in a castle on Lake Michigan's shore, had already assembled what art historians would later recognize as one of the most important early Impressionist collections outside France. She was creating taste, not following it. When New York's elite finally started acquiring Impressionists decades later, when auction prices began climbing, when Monet and Renoir became respectable, they were following a path Bertha Palmer had cleared from a barbaric, Midwestern city they'd written off as culturally irrelevant. She was proving, painting by painting, that new money properly deployed could create culture just as legitimate as old money's tired European imitations. The castle performed another function, though this one was rarely spoken aloud. It intimidated the hell out of everyone. When you approached that massive Romanesque arch, when you stepped into that three-story great hall, you were forced to acknowledge that Potter Palmer, son of Quakers, seller of dry goods, self-made millionaire from a city that didn't exist when his parents were born, had built something more imposing than most of the inherited mansions of New York's Knickerbocker elite. The castle was an argument made in stone. New money, properly deployed with vision and confidence, could create something more meaningful than old money's fossilized traditions. It was democracy wearing a crown, capitalism building a cathedral to itself, American ambition refusing to apologize for its swamp-born origins. For 20 years, the castle reigned. Then Potter Palmer died. May 4, 1902. Heart failure. He was 75, still active in business, still planning new ventures, still believing that tomorrow would be larger than today. His death was not unexpected. He'd been slowing down for a year, but it was somehow unprepared for, as if a man that vital couldn't simply cease. The Palmer Empire, hotels, real estate, investments spanning Chicago's commercial core, passed to Bertha and their two sons, Potter Jr., born 1875, and Honoré, born 1874, named for Bertha's father. The fortune was estimated at $8 million, equivalent to perhaps $250 million today, though such conversions barely capture the reality of what inherited wealth meant in an age without income taxes. The castle, suddenly, was a widow's home. Bertha was 53, wealthy beyond imagination, and free in ways Victorian women rarely were. She could have retreated into mourning, could have become one of those Gilded Age relics haunting oversized mansions in black bombazine. Instead, she doubled down. She continued her social dominance, her art collecting, her political activism. She supported suffrage causes more openly now that Potter's conservative business associates couldn't object. She championed labor reforms, parks for working-class neighborhoods, educational opportunities for women. But something had shifted. The castle, built as a declaration of partnership, now felt different. Emptier. The rooms echoed. The great hall's soaring space, once filled with two voices planning the future, now held only one. She began spending more time in Florida, where Potter had invested heavily in Sarasota real estate starting in 1910. She built a winter estate there, Osprey Point, later known as the Oaks, and poured energy into developing Sarasota as a winter resort for wealthy Northerners. Chicago started seeing less of her. The castle, though still magnificent, started to feel like a stage set without a play. Then came World War I, and the world the Palmers had built simply ended. The Gilded Age had already been dying, progressives attacked its excesses, reformers exposed its hypocrisies, labor unions challenged its assumptions, but the war killed it completely. The Gilded Age optimism, the belief that wealth could buy civilization, that progress was inevitable, that American plutocracy was a kind of enlightened aristocracy, all of it died in the trenches of Europe. The post-war world had less patience for castles, less tolerance for the kind of unabashed luxury the Palmer Mansion represented. The new generation of wealthy Chicagoans built differently, sleeker, more modern, less defiant. Castles started to look like hubris, like relics of a discredited age. Bertha Palmer died in 1918, in Florida, far from the castle that had been her masterwork. She was 69. Pneumonia, following what newspapers called a brief illness, though she'd been in declining health for months. She was buried in Chicago, in Graceland Cemetery, beside Potter in a massive granite mausoleum designed by McKim, Mead and White, a final monument to Gilded Age ambition. Her sons inherited everything, including a massive fortress they neither needed nor wanted. Potter Jr. and Honoré had their own families, their own homes in the rapidly developing Gold Coast neighborhood just south of the castle. They'd grown up in the castle, certainly, but it was their parents' dream, not theirs. The building represented an era they'd outgrown, a style of life increasingly at odds with the 20th century's streamlined modernity. They kept it for a while, maintained it dutifully, occasionally used it for family gatherings and charity events. But it was already becoming a museum of a dead era, a monument to ambitions that felt increasingly foreign. The 1920s were not kind to Gilded Age architecture. Prohibition killed the culture of lavish entertaining that had justified homes like the Palmer Castle. The Great Depression finished off any lingering romanticism about plutocratic excess. By the 1930s, the castle was an anachronism, expensive to maintain, heating bills alone were astronomical, impossible to staff adequately in an age when domestic service was declining, occupying valuable lakefront real estate that could be put to more profitable use. The neighborhood around it had changed too. Lake Shore Drive was transforming from a leisurely parkway into a major urban thoroughfare. High-rise apartment buildings were beginning to rise along the lakefront, blocking the castle's lake views, making it look increasingly isolated and out of place. The castle's massive footprint, taking up space that could be subdivided into dozens of profitable building lots, started looking less like civic pride and more like wasted money. The Palmer heirs, reading the writing on the wall, began exploring options. Could the castle be converted? Turned into a museum? Donated to an institution? But who wanted a 42-room Romanesque fortress in 1940? The operating costs alone were prohibitive. The Art Institute of Chicago considered it briefly as a potential satellite gallery or event space, then declined, too expensive to heat, too difficult to secure, too expensive to adapt for public use. The Chicago Historical Society expressed mild interest, then backed away when they calculated insurance costs. Private buyers were even scarcer. Who had the money or desire to maintain a castle? Gilded Age mansions were being demolished or converted to institutional use throughout American cities. The generation that had built them was dying, and their children wanted houses that didn't require small armies of servants to operate. Then came World War II, and the calculus changed again. The war effort demanded efficiency, modernity, forward thinking. Every resource was supposed to contribute to victory. Castles were not just impractical, they were actively offensive, symbols of the kind of European feudalism America was supposedly fighting against. The castle represented inequality, concentrated wealth, aristocratic pretension. Post-war America was going to be different, democratic, egalitarian, modern. By 1945, the Palmer Castle wasn't a landmark. It was an embarrassment, a relic of robber baron excess that no longer aligned with American values. The heirs made their decision. They would demolish it. The announcement came in 1949. The Potter Palmer Castle, Chicago's most distinctive private residence for over 6 decades, would be torn down to make way for, well, that part was initially vague. Modern development. Apartment buildings, most likely. Or maybe a hotel. Something that made economic sense. Something that generated steady income from every square foot. Something efficient. The response was shockingly muted. A few architecture critics wrote mildly disapproving articles, noting the loss of an important Richardsonian Romanesque example. The Chicago Tribune ran a nostalgic photo spread showing the castle in its glory days, with captions lamenting changing times. The Art Institute expressed regret. The Chicago chapter of the American Institute of Architects issued a statement deploring the loss. But there was no organized preservation effort, no public outcry, no wealthy benefactor swooping in to save it. No one chained themselves to the gates. No petition campaigns. No 11th-hour reprieves. Chicago, collectively, shrugged and looked away. Why? How does a city let its most iconic private building disappear without a fight? Part of the answer was practical and legal. Historic preservation as a formal movement barely existed in 1949 America. There was no National Register of Historic Places, that wouldn't be created until 1966. No legal mechanism to protect privately owned buildings. No historic district ordinances. The National Trust for Historic Preservation wasn't founded until 1949, the same year demolition was announced, and it had no power beyond moral persuasion. If the Palmer heirs wanted to demolish their property, that was their absolute legal right. Property rights trumped everything else. But the deeper answer was cultural. Chicago, and America broadly, had decided its Gilded Age past was something to escape, not preserve. The castle represented everything post-war Americans claimed to reject: inequality, excess, concentrated wealth, aristocratic pretension. It was built by robber barons while immigrants lived in tenements. It consumed resources that could house dozens of families. It was a medieval fantasy in a city struggling with modern housing shortages. Post-war America was supposed to be democratic, egalitarian, forward-looking. Castles didn't fit that narrative. They needed to go, swept away along with the other embarrassing relics of an undemocratic past. Modern architecture, clean, efficient, stripped of historical ornamentation, would be America's new face. The international style, Le Corbusier's machines for living, Mies van der Rohe's less is more, this was the future. Stone castles were the past, and the past needed to die. So in February 1950, the wreckers arrived. The demolition contract went to a firm that specialized in such work. They demolished other large buildings, knew how to do it safely and efficiently. Their job was simple: reduce the castle to rubble, salvage anything marketable, haul away the rest. They had 6 weeks. The demolition was systematic and brutal. They started with the interiors, working from top to bottom like surgeons disassembling a body. The third floor came first, the art gallery with its crimson silk walls. The paintings were long gone, bequeathed to the Art Institute. Workers ripped out the silk damask, revealing bare plaster underneath. They sledgehammered through ornamental plasterwork, brought down coffered ceilings that had taken craftsmen months to install. The oak paneling came next. Some of it was carefully removed, carved panels and mantels that might be resold to salvage dealers. But most of it was simply destroyed, ripped from walls, broken into pieces small enough to haul away. The great staircase, which had borne the weight of presidents and suffragists and artists and plutocrats, which had been carved from oak that took decades to grow and cure, was reduced to splinters. Fireplaces, each a carved masterpiece, were sledgehammered into rubble. The ballroom's parquet floors, laid in complex geometric patterns, were ripped up. The stained glass windows, those jewel-toned abstractions that had transformed sunlight into liquid color, were smashed or pried out. A few fragments were preserved by private collectors who scrambled to save something. Some elements were salvaged. Several fireplace mantels ended up in other buildings. There are rumors that pieces of the Palmer Castle survive in various Chicago homes and institutions, though documentation is sparse. Some of the bronze hardware, door handles, hinges, lighting fixtures, was sold to architectural salvage dealers. A few of the stained glass panels were saved. But these were exceptions. Most of it was simply destroyed, hauled away as garbage, dumped in landfills or used as fill for highway construction. The castle was being literally erased, broken down into component materials, stripped of identity, reduced to raw atoms. The building that had taken 3 years and millions of dollars to construct was being unmade in weeks for a fraction of that cost. Then came the exterior. The wrecking ball, that blunt instrument of urban renewal, swung day after day. The granite blocks that had been so laboriously hauled from Massachusetts, the rusticated brownstone that had weathered Lake Michigan storms for 68 years, the massive Romanesque arch that had announced the castle's presence from blocks away, all of it came down. Each impact sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Dust clouds rose like smoke signals announcing the death of an era. Windows in nearby buildings rattled. The sound, witnesses reported, was apocalyptic, not just demolition but desecration. Neighbors came to watch, drawn by the spectacle. Some took photographs. A few took fragments of stone as souvenirs. Children played in the rubble. But mostly, people just watched silently as the castle disappeared, floor by floor, wall by wall, day by day. By April 1950, it was gone. The site was bare earth, churned mud, scattered rubble. You could stand where the great hall had soared 3 stories and see nothing but emptiness. 68 years of history, 3 years of construction, millions of dollars in artistry and craft, the work of dozens of immigrant laborers whose names we'll never know, obliterated in 6 weeks. The Chicago Tribune, in a brief article buried on an inside page, noted the demolition's completion with the same tone one might use to report the removal of a dead tree. Potter Palmer Castle gone, the headline read. Not demolished. Not destroyed. Just, gone. Passive voice. No one responsible. It simply ceased to exist. 1 paragraph. No photographs. No obituary for a building that had hosted presidents, housed one of America's finest art collections, served as headquarters for the world's Columbian Exposition. Gone. In the decades that followed, the site became exactly what the economics demanded, profitable and forgettable. 2 high-rise apartment towers rose in the castle's place, 1350 and 1360, North Lake Shore Drive, completed in the early 1950s. They are 22 stories tall, brick and concrete, designed in the stripped-down modernist style popular in post-war America. They maximize the lakefront views that had once belonged to Potter and Bertha alone, packing dozens of apartments into the same footprint the castle occupied. The buildings are fine. Serviceable. They house hundreds of people. They generate steady rental income. They are, in every measurable economic way, a more efficient use of the land. And they are utterly, catastrophically boring. Walk past them today and you'll see nothing that suggests what stood there before. No plaque. No marker. No sidewalk commemoration. No indication that this particular stretch of Lake Shore Drive once held a building so audacious it made European aristocrats seethe with envy. The Chicago Tribune did eventually install a marker of distinction in the 1990s, but it's easy to miss, a small plaque noting the site's historical significance without capturing any sense of what was lost. The apartment towers are anonymous. They could be anywhere, Miami, Minneapolis, Manhattan. They have no relationship to their site beyond maximizing its commercial potential. They tell no story except the story of efficient capital allocation. They are buildings designed to house people and generate profit, nothing more. Chicago forgot completely. The Palmer Castle vanished from civic consciousness with remarkable speed. By the 1960s, most Chicagoans under 40 had no memory of it. By the 1980s, it was a footnote in architectural histories. Even today, among people who consider themselves knowledgeable about Chicago history, the Palmer Castle draws blank stares. Potter Palmer? Oh yes, the hotel. Bertha Palmer? Something about the World's Fair. But the castle? Gone. Not just physically but mentally, erased from collective memory. But here's what haunts me, the Palmer Castle's demolition was not unique. It was a template, a proof of concept, a demonstration that even the most significant buildings could be destroyed with minimal opposition if the economics were favorable and the narrative convincing enough. In the decade following the Palmer Castle's demolition, Chicago demolished dozens of historically significant buildings. The pattern was always the same: declare the building impractical, emphasize the economic benefits of destruction, dismiss preservationists as nostalgic sentimentalists, demolish quickly before opposition can organize, build something profitable and forgettable, never look back. The 1950s and 60s urban renewal era was catastrophic for American architectural heritage. New York demolished the original Pennsylvania station in 1963, an act of vandalism so egregious it finally sparked a national preservation movement. The outcry over Penn Station led directly to the Landmarks Preservation Commission and the broader historic preservation movement. But by then, countless buildings were already gone. Chicago demolished Louis Sullivan's Chicago Stock Exchange building in 1972 despite massive protests. Preservationists fought for years, organized campaigns, filed lawsuits. Richard Nicol, an architectural photographer, died in the building documenting ornamental details before they were destroyed, crushed when a stairwell collapsed during demolition. His death became a rallying cry for preservation. But the building still came down. Philadelphia, Boston, St. Louis, San Francisco, every major American city has a list of irreplaceable buildings destroyed in the name of progress, efficiency, modernity. The pattern, established with the Palmer Castle and countless other buildings demolished with barely a whisper of protest, proved devastatingly effective. The Palmer Castle was among the first, and its demolition established the rules: economics trump culture, efficiency beats beauty, the future always matters more than the past, and objections can be dismissed as sentimentality. These rules shaped urban development for decades and continue shaping it today. We've become a country that treats its own history as disposable, something to be cleared away the moment it stops generating maximum revenue. The loss is not merely aesthetic. When we demolished the Palmer Castle, we lost more than a building. We lost a physical connection to the people who built Chicago, not just Potter and Bertha, but the immigrant craftsmen whose hands carved that oak and fitted that stone. We lost a tangible reminder of what audacity looks like, what happens when someone decides the rules don't apply to them and builds a castle in a swamp. We lost a teaching tool, a place where future generations could walk through rooms and understand, viscerally, how the Gilded Age actually felt, not through photographs or text, but through space and light and scale. We lost a mirror. Because the Palmer Castle, for all its excess, reflected something true about America, our belief that anyone, even a dry goods merchant from upstate New York, could build something eternal. That new money could create culture. That the past didn't have to determine the future. The castle was an argument for possibility, for transformation, for the idea that you could remake yourself and the world around you through sheer will and resources. Its demolition reflected something true too, our belief that nothing is eternal except change, that economics trump culture, that the past is always less important than next quarter's profits. That we'd rather have efficient anonymity than difficult grandeur. That beauty without profit margins is just expensive inefficiency waiting to be corrected. Both reflections are accurate. Both are America. But only one survives. The Palmer Art Collection, at least, endured. After Bertha's death, much of it was bequeathed to the Art Institute of Chicago, where it forms the core of one of the finest Impressionist collections outside France. You can stand in the Art Institute today and look at the same Monets that once hung in crimson silk-covered rooms in the castle, the same Renoirs that scandalized conventional taste, the same Pissarros that Bertha bought when no one else understood their worth. The paintings survived even though the rooms did not. They hang in climate-controlled galleries, carefully lit, properly conserved, accessible to everyone. Does that count as preservation? Or is it just salvage, saving what's portable and letting everything else burn? The paintings are better off, arguably. More people see them. They're professionally maintained. They're protected forever by institutional commitment. But they've lost their context, the crimson silk walls, the northern light streaming through tall windows, the sense of discovery that came from encountering radical art in a private home rather than a museum. They've been preserved but also neutered. Made safe. I think about the people who demolished the castle. The wrecking crew who spent 6 weeks systematically destroying something more beautiful and historically significant than anything they'd ever build themselves. The foreman who organized the work, checked it off his list, moved on to the next job. The equipment operators who swung the wrecking ball into stone that had stood for nearly 7 decades. Did any of them hesitate? Did anyone stop, mid-swing, and think, what are we doing? Did the foreman who organized the demolition ever drive past the empty lot afterward and feel something other than satisfaction at a job efficiently completed? Or had they learned, as America had learned, not to ask those questions? To see buildings as economic units rather than cultural artifacts, as assets to be liquidated rather than inheritances to be protected? To understand that in a capitalist system, beauty that doesn't generate profit is just expensive inefficiency waiting to be corrected? The Palmer Castle was demolished because it cost more to maintain than to destroy. That sentence is economically true and contains everything wrong with how we've chosen to relate to our own history. Chicago has spent the last 40 years slowly, painfully learning to value its architectural heritage. The preservation movement that the Palmer Castle's demolition helped birth, along with the even more infamous Penn Station demolition in New York, has saved hundreds of buildings. Landmark status protects significant structures. The Chicago Architecture Center gives popular tours celebrating the city's design legacy. Daniel Burnham's motto, "Make no little plans," is quoted reverently in planning meetings and real estate pitches. Historic districts preserve neighborhood character. Adaptive reuse transforms old buildings into new uses. Warehouses become lofts, factories become offices, mansions become museums. Chicago takes pride in its architectural heritage, markets it to tourists, uses it to define civic identity. But we can't tour the Palmer Castle. We can't walk through its great hall or stand in its art gallery or run our hands along the rusticated stone of its facade. We can only look at old photographs, grainy black and white images that flatten 3 dimensions into 2, that show us shapes but not spaces, that document but cannot resurrect. We can't experience what it felt like to approach that Romanesque arch for the first time, to step from Chicago's streets into a space that insisted beauty and ambition were not just compatible but necessary. We can't understand, viscerally, what Bertha accomplished by creating a cultural salon in a city New York considered barbaric. We can't see what immigrant craftsmen built with hands that history forgot to document. Gone means gone. Demolished means dead. The preservation movement arrived too late to save the Palmer Castle, and too late for hundreds of other buildings demolished before we collectively decided that history might matter more than profit margins. The city forgot the castle. But the castle won't let us forget what we're capable of, both the building and the destroying. Every time Chicago, or any American city, demolishes a historic building for a parking lot or a luxury condo tower, the ghost of the Palmer Castle whispers, "You've done this before. You know how it ends. You do it anyway." Is there a lesson? Can a demolished building teach anything beyond the brute fact of its absence? Perhaps this: beauty is fragile and economics are brutal, and when they conflict, economics win unless we decide otherwise. The Palmer Castle fell because we, collectively, as a city, as a culture, chose to let it fall. We could have saved it. We could have found a use for it, funded its preservation, protected it legally, insisted that some things matter more than profit. We didn't. We chose efficiency over meaning, and we got exactly what we chose: profitable anonymity where audacious beauty once stood. That choice is still being offered every day. In every city, every time a historic building is declared impractical and slated for demolition. We can keep choosing economics. We can keep watching our past disappear into landfills. We can keep building forgettable efficiency. Or we can remember what Chicago forgot, that some stones, once removed, leave holes that nothing else can fill. That a castle built by a dry goods merchant and brought to life by a woman who refused to be decorative contains more meaning than 1,000 optimized apartment towers. That our history, messy and problematic and excessive as it is, belongs to us, and once we throw it away, we can't get it back. The Potter Palmer Castle stood for 68 years. It's been gone for 75. The absence has lasted longer than the presence. But the absence speaks just as loudly, if you're listening. Chicago's skyline is magnificent, a testament to engineering, ambition, commercial power. Stand on Lakeshore Drive today and you'll see towers that make the Palmer Castle look quaint. Buildings taller, sleeker, more expensive, more technically sophisticated. Willis Tower, John Hancock Center, the clusters of glass spires rising along the river, these are impressive achievements, undeniably. But none of them are castles. None of them were built by someone who decided the rules didn't apply, who transplanted European feudalism to American soil and made it work through sheer force of will and vision. None of them represent what the Palmer Castle represented: the possibility of transformation, the power of audacity, the idea that you could build your own reality if you had enough determination and didn't ask permission. We demolished that idea along with the building. And every time we passed the site, no, not empty, filled now with profitable efficiency, we are passing the scene of a crime. Not a legal crime, certainly. The Palmer heirs had every legal right to demolish their property. But a crime against memory, against meaning, against the part of ourselves that needs beauty and history to be more than just expensive inefficiency. The castle is gone. But what we destroyed when we demolished it is still with us, still shaping us, still teaching us what happens when we forget that some things matter more than money. Potter Palmer built a castle in a swamp, transforming mud and ambition into stone and grandeur. Chicago let it fall, transforming irreplaceable heritage into profitable real estate. Both facts are equally true. Both are equally damning. Both are equally us. The question facing every American city, every day, remains the same: what are we building? And what are we destroying to build it? The Palmer Castle can't answer. But its absence asks the question over and over, a missing tooth in the city's smile, a gap that nothing else can fill. We are the heirs to a country that builds castles and tears them down, that creates beauty and destroys it, that values everything and preserves nothing. The Palmer Castle's ghost haunts every demolition, every highest and best use calculation, every time profit margins trump preservation.